happy first anniversary Baldur's Gate 3. It has been quite a ride for us in the community. We've witnessed the creation of an industry-defining game made by a company that exceeds expectation, while also setting the new standard on what a game should be. Just the game and the community around it. As a means of celebration, I will be ranking my own top 10 Baldur's Gate 3 builds, which was created by yours truly. I will also be factoring in on how popular they are for you guys, while also talking about the pros and cons of each. So without further ado, let's get to it. Enjoy. We're gonna start off the list with one of the most unique healers out there, the demonic cleric WitchDoctor.
I'm going to rob them of hope. And hope is the spread wings of a bat. Fear makes you mine.
It is really reliable if you're just new to the game and want to have a really solid healer in your party. Starting off with the build benefits, it has one of the best healing capabilities in the game. Overall, hands down, because we are utilizing the power of Beacon of Hope. Beacon of Hope is an AoE spell that eliminates the factor of RNG whenever we are healing our allies. In terms of utility, this build is just a beast with its levels in Warlock, Bard, and Cleric. It can stack insane amount of buffs to a target, or just an overall aura battery for your team. If you want to debuff your enemies using radiating orb charges, or maybe poison, this build got you covered. Want to increase the chances of your damage to hit, or maybe just a damage increase in general for your party, this build is the way to go. On top of that, it has great survivability. Not only you have access to the heals, you also have access to Sanctuary at level 1, so you can just move around as safely as possible, providing so much advantage to your party is just insane. For the disadvantages, it is most likely ally dependent. It really shines if it has around 2 to 3 allies and being the dedicated support for your team. Another one is damage output is quite low because of its focus into supporting and healing, but it compensates with its debuff functions. If you want to have a dedicated healer to your team, I guarantee you're gonna be having fun with this. Number 9 will be our unkillable wizard Battlemage build.
Oh shit, here we go again.
This build is quite popular with you guys because of the sheer uniqueness and how powerful this build can be. This flips the whole concept of the mages should be on the backline and get supported by its teammates and turns that backliner class into a frontlining tank. By using the power of magic and arcane, our battle mage is guaranteed to be the last man standing. One of the advantages for this build is that it's just ridiculously tanky. Just for context, this is the only tank build that I've ever tried that can face tank the breath attack of Answer the Dracolith without taking too much damage. This is not just a one-trick pony, it can also deal heaps of magical damage, and it's basically a utility magic bot for your party. The build is focused on arcane ward stacking, so most likely you will need to use your spells in order to increase your arcane ward some more. It can also be really powerful early game, just around level 5 to 6, and it doesn't need that much item to function. Just give it some heavy armor and a shield, and you're good to go. Now for disadvantages of the build, it doesn't play too well with a group setup. If you want to maximize the power of this build is perfect for your solo play or maybe duos. In a group setup, this build is still functional just because of the arcane ward that it can grant its allies, which leads me to another weakness of the build. It is resource dependent, talking about arcane ward stacks, and you really need to mine the arcane ward in order for you to not get obliterated by groups of enemies. In terms of strategy for the build, most likely you will be fishing for opportunity attacks. If you want a solid magic tank, this is the way to go. Number 8 is another powerhouse of a tank. That will be the Divine Guardian build. This is the best tank cleric build that you might want to get, using its holy power to grant divine judgment to its enemies. It is a ridiculously effective tank that can debuff your enemies in a wide AoE, rendering them useless for the whole duration of the fight. Now for the advantages, this build is just really powerful in terms of like AoE debuff. and can deal so much AoE damage to your opponents is just insane. Using its holy power of the Divine Guardian as well as its AoE ability of the Cleric, that is Radiance of the Dawn, it can stack so much debuff to your opponents, that will be the Radiating Orb stacks, and spread that debuff to as many targets like no other builds in the game. The build gets powerful really early and just needs minimal amount of gear, and most likely you will be using this gear towards the late game acts. For utility and function, this build is also really useful. The build is generally a mixture of a tank as well as a support for your party. It also possesses high mobility and can stick to its targets as fast as possible. With levels in Cleric, Paladin board, most likely you will be sticking to your targets, debuffing them with Radiating Orb stacks, as well as buffing your allies as much as possible. For the cons, I think the build is overtuned and overdesigned, and it's borderline unfair to the enemies. The fights get a little bit boring if you use this build. Another disadvantage of the build is that it has limited gear progression. Most likely you will be using the same armor throughout your playthrough, but if you want to have a really OP tank, most likely you will be needing this one. Number 7 will be our Frozen Queen, that will be the Cryomage. This is quite special because it was recommended by one of our community members and it is ridiculously fun to play around. If you're into elemental builds and has a certain element in mind pertaining to ice element, the Cryomage will be your thing. One of the advantages of this build is that it has really powerful AoE control spells using the Hunger of Adar as well as the Ice Storm in order to devastate the battlefield not only with your insane AoE damage but with your AoE control. Frost damage, freezing your opponents, utilizing Frostbite or Frozen. This is one of the builds that specializes on those effects. Aside from its AoE abilities, it can also utilize the power of the Warlock to keep on pushing your enemies and proning them. The Cryomage really plays well with the other spellcasting builds. It's very effective if you play them together with the same elemental type. Now for the cons of the build, most likely it is team comp specific, mostly requires ranged characters in order to effectively use this in the battlefield just because of this build's nature. If it's not quite obvious for you, it disrupts the battlefield a lot. Because of its wide AoE spells, the build limits movement and repositioning capabilities of other builds, so most likely you will be needing a few items and specific builds in order for you to effectively utilize the Cryomage. Next up is one of my favorites, that will be the Destroyer Monk build. This build utilizes the power of the monk in order to obliterate its enemies into dust. This build can dish out 10 to 12 attacks in a single turn with the other advantages that you can get for the build, like the insane single target burst that the Destroyer Monk can dish out. Build is also one of my boss killer builds and can eliminate your target in just turn 1. It is not like your other meme builds that you find around where the only function is how high the damage can be. Most likely it's not quite functional in actual combat. The Destroyer Monk is one of those builds that can really dish out that damage while being very useful to your party members. Disadvantage for the build is it's quite gear dependent. It really needs some items to make it effectively powerful. On the bright side, the gear progression of this build is not stale, so you're going to be having fun hunting down these items that this build needs. Another disadvantage that I noticed is that it has specific playstyle. If you're not a fan of that hit and run playstyle, most likely you will not be having fun with this build. This build utilizes its high mobility and its burst damage in order for it to be effectively powerful. You can use this build solo or maybe duos, and I highly advise you try this out in a duo play. Number 5 is gonna be really fun because of the Warlock Poisoner build. This is another unique build that I designed, utilizing Baldur's Gate 3 mechanics, and it's just a pain for your enemies to deal with. One of the main advantages of this build is that it has a really wide AoE damage and control abilities, using poison and cloud kill to eliminate heaps of enemies in a single turn. You can play this build same as the Cryomage, pushing your enemies to the cloud kill as much as possible, or maybe just repositioning it to another favorable location. While you're at it, you will also be poisoning your enemies and decreasing their effectivity in in the battle. Most of the items that you will be needing as a spellcaster will be found in Act 1. That means that your effectivity will just be increased towards your late game. It also has great mobility using the blink or maybe using haste force. You can also play this build solo if you want, or maybe duos. Most likely you will be having fun with this build in a duo setup. Now for the disadvantage of the build, it is position dependent. You really need to reposition yourself properly in order to effectively use this build and not accidentally poison your allies using your spells. It is also a battlefield disruptor. Most likely you will be needing a specialized party in order to effectively use this powerhouse of a build. Now we're on to the top 4, and we're gonna start off with our Barbarian Savage build. If you want to roleplay as a brainless barbarian, just savagely attacking your enemies without a care in the world, this is the build for you. The advantages of this build: it is practically unkillable because of its life-stealing capabilities, and it's able to life-steal all the damage that it took in just a single turn. Really high resistances and loves to get up close and personal. So if you want to have a frontliner slash striker, the Barbarian Savage is for you. As I mentioned before, the build really loves to take damage, so utilize its high HP and really high resistance to your heart's content. It's also perfect for a party on a solo setup. Most likely this build will shine if you have a squad of ranged characters and this is one of your strikers slash tank. The build also has a really early power spike, I could argue around level 3 to 5. Topping all of that, it also has high AC and mobility, so you can get up close as fast as possible. For the disadvantages, the build really likes to drop those noxious fumes. Any melee characters that you have will not be having fun with this character around. So most likely other builds like the Cryomage, Poisoner, other ranged characters that I mentioned earlier will be perfect as party members for the Savage. Number 3 is the ultimate Bard Skirmisher build that is quite unfair to play around. If you love the Bard class and want to be as OP as possible, stacking as much critical modifiers as you want while turning your enemies into literal training dummies just standing around waiting for their death. Advantages of this build, as I mentioned earlier, it is a crit stacking beast. You're only gonna need all of the crit stacking items that you can find and you are golden. It's also a crowd control monster, able to lock down groups of enemies without any worries by using control spells, or maybe just attack them and trigger the Mortal Reminder skill. Not to mention the noxious fumes that you will be spreading around. The Skirmisher will be a total headache for your enemies, I guarantee that. With the nature of you being a bard, most likely you will be a utility god as well. You can buff your allies using your bard spells, or maybe just provide range cover. You can do all of that with this build. It's perfect for solo, duo, or maybe a party setup. Has a really early power spike around Act 1 and has great late game scaling because of the late game items that you will be unlocking that increases your chance to crit. Now for the number 2 spot, that will be the Fighter Raidboss build.
The one who stands at the pinnacle of all races.
私が7つの大罪、傲慢の罪、ライオン神、エスカノール様だ。
Just the name itself screams being top tier. This is one of the builds that showcase the power of a pure class monster with a few sprinkles on top. Just the sheer amount of utility and power this build can dish out is just next level. I could argue this is the final boss in the game and your enemies will tremble at the sight of this monster. For the advantage, as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the pure class juggernaut with its fighter abilities. You can disable, prone, fear, heal yourself, dish out so much damage in a single turn, and also counter the attacks of your opponents. But the damage output and mobility is just top notch for this build. This build is able to rival the Destroyer Monk build and can dish out 10 to 12 attacks in a single turn, just moving from target to target, giving them the most powerful debuff in the game, that is death. As a wise man once said, you can't do anything while you're dead. It also has a really early power spike. On top of that, it has really high AC, and it's perfect for solo and group play. What I really appreciate about this build is that it doesn't have any weaknesses to it that much, and it's just those brain dead build that you can just use whenever you want without any setup or preparation. Just you, the sword, and the face of your enemies. That's it. What can top the raid boss in my opinion? I think that will be the pure evil Darklord.
And you are the savior. Your strength will be their shield, and your will their sword. You remain unbroken, for your fight is eternal.
This build is just nasty to play. It's basically the raid boss but better. It utilizes the power of the paladin, warlock, and cleric in the same package, giving you this unholy monster that will obliterate anything in its path. I could argue the damage output of the Darklord is much higher than the raid boss because of the smites of this monster. You can just watch HPs disappear with just a single attack. Another thing that's better for the Darklord is that it has necrotic AoE damage with its necrotic spirit guardians, meaning that anything that is close to its vicinity most likely will take damage by just its sheer presence. In terms of utility, the Darklord is just much better. Can fear, heal, increase its damage, use its range abilities, or just pour everything into its might. Even if you lose steam with your spell slots, most likely you will be mowing them down with your ridiculously high physical damage. But if you ask me, what sends this build to the next level, I would say that the compatibility of this to other Origin characters is really good. I highly advise you use this build with the Dark Urge, or maybe play as Karlach if you want to utilize the soul coins. And that's it guys, thank you for watching my top 10 builds. Happy 1st anniversary to Baldur's Gate 3 once again, and thank you Lauren Studios for making this masterpiece of a game. It has been an honor and I've been enjoying to create content for this community while looking forward for more exciting content in the future. Anyway, what do you guys think about the list? Would love to know all about it, including your questions and clarifications in a comment below. Shoutouts for all the people who subscribe and keep supporting the channel. I really appreciate you guys for all the amazing support. And for all the people subscribed yet, thank you for watching my videos and I hope I earn your subscriptions in the future. But if you're new today, please don't hesitate to hit that subscribe button. Want to know why Baldur's Gate 3 is just that good? Or maybe if you're curious what are the top mods for July, just click these videos right here. Finally, that's it for me. I'll see you soon on the next Master Box Show. Peace out. Bye guys.